Hello everyone! Welcome to our keynote presentation, Ataxia, Dysmetria of Thought, and the Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Syndrome, presented by Dr. Jeremy D. Schmahmann. Dr. Schmahmann is a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and a neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where he is the founding director since 1994 of the Ataxia Unit, director of the Laboratory for Neuroanatomy and Cerebellar Neurobiology, and a member of the Cognitive Behavioral Neurology Unit. Dr. Schmahmann's research and clinical practice focuses on neurology and basic science of the ataxias and other cerebellar disorders, and he has pioneered the role of the cerebellum in cognition and emotion. I am Samantha Pierce, the clinical research coordinator in the Schmahmann lab, and I'll be the moderator for this presentation. We are delighted to bring you the education web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of the screen and type your questions into the drop-down box that appears on the screen. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located on the promotional board at the bottom or center of your screen. Or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located on the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Schmahmann. I will now turn the presentation over to him.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, LabRoots, for the opportunity to present this work to the neuroscience community. I'm going to tell you what has turned out to be a remarkable story about the cerebellum and its role in nervous system function. The title of the talk, Ataxia, Dysmetria, and the Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Syndrome, encapsulates how we've gone from cerebellum as motor control device to cerebellum with a much wider range of involvement in nervous system repertoires of behavior. Just to start off with, the disclosures include some books that you may find to be helpful in your local library to talk about cerebellar anatomy, neurobiology, and cerebellar diseases. Some of the work I'll be describing includes some of the licensed work of scales that we've used here at Mass General Hospital, and the consulting relates to drug companies that are finally coming to the table with pharmaceutical agents to try and help improve the lives of patients with cerebellar inherited ataxias and other forms. The story starts with our teaching from many years ago that the cerebellar syndrome is ataxia. Ataxia of gait, dysmetria of the extremities, in coordination of control of the arms and the legs, speech problems or dysarthria, and a range of oculomotor impairments. And these were described by some of the great names in the history of neurology. Sanger Brown, Pierre Marie, Felix Babinski, and Gordon Holmes, whose examination we still use today in the assessment of the cerebellar motor syndrome. So let me show you some cases of ataxia that gives you a sense of what the cerebellar motor syndrome is. The first is this gentleman with a gait impairment, a wide-based, staggering, and uncertain gait, typical of cerebellar ataxia. The next is the heel-to-shin test, where one sees the jerkiness, side-to-side movements, and instability as one slides the heel down the opposite shin. This is a demonstration of a young woman having difficulty with the control of the extremity as she reaches from her nose to my finger, endpoint dysmetria and oscillation at the elbow. And then we have some problems with the speech.
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, October, September, November, December.
Characterized by difficulty with articulation and clarity in particular. This young woman's story exemplifies the problem with cerebellum as pure motor control device. At the age of 14, she had a cerebellar hemorrhage from a rupture of a vascular malformation. And for the next 2 years, she had difficulty with a variety of behaviors. She was not able to speak, she didn't swallow, she had a feeding tube placed, she was unable to keep her clothes on all the time and tried to disrobe. She had some aggression, some striking out, and along with all of this, there was only a mild cerebellar syndrome. And what one sees on the imaging is that the cerebral hemisphere upstairs looks quite normal, but there's marked disruption of the cerebellar anatomy as a result of the cerebellar hemorrhage. This case encapsulates the problem with explaining cerebellum purely as a motor control device. So let me take you through the story as how we go from cerebellar syndrome equals ataxia to the cerebellar motor syndrome is ataxia, and we'll talk about what the rest of cerebellum does, as we now know from the series of experiments that have been performed over the years. I came to this question from patients with strokes in the deep parts of the brain. This first one is a stroke in the genu of the internal capsule that disrupts the discussion between frontal lobe and thalamus, and this patient had a neglect syndrome, had difficulty drawing on the left side of the page, only focusing on the right, trouble drawing a clock, ignored the left side of a star, had difficulty placing cities and states on a rudimentary map of the US, and a remarkably fragmented image of a person. And the second case was one that was then part of a series of patients with caudate strokes, exemplified by the stroke right there, in whom there was a neglect syndrome also of the contralateral space. These are hemispheric syndromes, usually from the parietal lobe, resulting from strokes deep down in the brain. And my question at that time, in the early 1980s, was if these syndromes can produce behavioral changes from areas we thought were purely motor control, what then could be the story about cerebellum, the big motor control region down in the infratentorial regions? The story, in fact, goes back a long time. This is Vincenzo Malaccarni, who in 1776 published his monograph that described the major anatomical features of the cerebellum. What we have subsequently come to learn from the translations of Italian scientists who looked at his papers is that Malaccarni was interested in the cerebellum because of his question about the relationship of the number of folia in the cerebellum and the level of intelligence. So the very first story dissecting cerebellar anatomy and biology was promoted by the question of cerebellum and its relationship not to motor control, but to higher function. The field then was influenced by Franz Joseph Gall, who we may know from phrenology, but who was in fact a spectacular anatomist, and people came from far and wide to see his dissections as identified here in the Atlas of Gall and Spurzheim in 1810. Franz Joseph Gall also believed that the cerebellum was critical for sexual behavior, and in fact he wrote a monograph on the functions of the cerebellum in which sexual proclivity and cerebellum were felt to be a hand in glove. And this idea led to the questioning of the hypothesis by a man called Marie Jean-Pierre Florenz, who was a giant of neurosciences in his day. And Florenz questioned Gall's ideas, and he did this in an experimental manner. He operated on pigeons, he damaged the cerebellum, and he showed that whereas Rolando had suggested that the cerebellum is important for movement and power, Florenz concluded that the cerebellum is important for coordination of movement. Pigeons could flap their wings, but they couldn't actually do it in a coordinated manner. Now, Florenz also believed that the cerebellum was the same everywhere and every part could do everything. It was the idea of equipotentiality, and from his time, the cerebellum has been thought of as a critical for and exclusive only for motor control, balance, equilibrium, and the cerebellar motor syndrome. Let me jump forward then to what we think about as the ways the cerebral hemisphere is organized and the way that the nervous system functions in contemporary neuroscience terminology. We now think about the brain as a distributed neural system comprising anatomical regions or nodes distributed around the brain, each with architectonic properties unique to that region, linked together in a precise manner, all working in concert to produce the ultimate behavior pattern. Well, that's all good and well, except you can see from all these diagrams there's a big missing part down the bottom. So from my perspective, if you turn the brain upside down, the cerebellum now becomes front and center, and that's what I want to talk about in the remainder of our time together today. I'd like to run through some of the essential anatomical features of cerebellar organization. When you look at the Cerebellar Atlas, which I encourage you to do, both here or in the monograph, the published paper in 1999, you can get a sense of the cerebellar fissures, labeled here, which separate the cerebellar lobules. And one can identify the anterior lobe in front of the primary fissure being relatively smaller in comparison to the much larger cerebellar posterior lobe, which has expanded massively through evolution. We have the cerebellar cortex, the deep white matter, and the nuclei situated deep within the cerebellar substance. And we can now look at the cerebellum in coordinate space, allowing us to study cerebellar functional imaging in a way that is much more precise than we previously were able to do so. The second aspect of dividing the cerebellar gross topography into anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and a third region called floccular nodular lobe is the fact that the cerebellar histology at the level of the cortex under the microscope is essentially homogeneous throughout. That stands in contrast to our understanding of the cerebral cortex, which has multiple different areas. The trilaminar cortex, going back to the Nobel Prize winning work of Santiago Ramón y Cajal more than 100 years ago, shows that we have the cerebellar molecular layer, the Purkinje layer between the outer layer and the inner granular cell layer seen over here. And the pattern of the organization of cortex is essentially consistent throughout. We can identify some of the fibers within the cerebellar cortex now with the new imaging, as we showed a few years ago, to show the different orthogonal organization of the fibers within the cerebellar molecular layer of the parallel fibers and the interneurons in the cerebellar cortex. Interestingly, and less well known, is a parasagittal zonation within the cerebellum. And these are important principles of anatomy that have relevance for the way the brain is structured. We know from the work of Jan Vucht going back to the 1960s that there is a parasagittal zonation in the cerebellar white matter, and using a monoclonal antibody stain, there is a parasagittal zonation in the cerebellar cortex as well, with zebrin positive and zebrin negative bands that map onto a cortical projection to the cerebellar deep nuclei and cortical projections from the inferior olivary nuclei. This is a parasagittal organization, both in terms of the histology, and the histochemistry, and the connectivity. Another important principle going back to the 1940s is the definitive determination that the equipotentiality idea of Florenz was inaccurate. And this is the work of Snyder and colleagues, in which we identify that when the flattened map of the cerebellum in a monkey or a cat, the legs are up the front, the arms further back, the head and neck at the posterior vermis of the cerebellum, and the second representation down here in the paramedian lobule, what we now call lobule 8. Furthermore, there is a representation of the visual and the auditory system, both from the cerebral cortex down and from the periphery in, landing up in the posterior aspect of the cerebellar vermis. There are a few important points from this early study now. One, the fact that the map that we see of the representations of the arms and legs, in fact, was a sensory map from which is derived the motor topography. It's a sensory mapping study. Secondly, the visual and auditory input led Snyder to conclude back in the 1940s and 50s that there was something more about cerebellum than simply motor control. And in retrospect, what we now also can tell is that this large area that is silent in terms of the inputs from the periphery is, in the old terminology, what one would have thought of as the silent frontal lobe. There is no somatosensory or motor representation in the lateral parts of the cerebral hemispheres. So that leads to the question, what in fact is going on there? For the pediatricians in the audience, it's important to remember that the cerebellar growth on MRI takes off markedly in the third trimester. So the cerebellum is growing both in the third trimester and also in postnatal life. So it's ongoing development even after birth in a remarkably strong way. When I came to the question of cerebellum and its role in higher order function, I teamed up with the man who became my mentor and teacher over the years, Deepak Pandya, one of the great neuroanatomists of the last century, and still active. Dr. Pandya and I made injections of traces in the cerebral cortex of the monkey, and we traced these pathways into the white matter and down into the brain stem, where they terminate in the pons. The reason that we did this was to question whether there is a pathway linking the association areas of the cerebral hemispheres important for high order function with the cortico-pontocerebellar system. The cerebral cortex talks to cerebellum by way of the pontine nuclei, and the cerebellum gets information back to the cerebral cortex by way of the corticothalamic projection. So the first step in this circuit is the corticopontine pathway. It has the injection of tracer and terminations in the pons. This is a summary diagram of many years of work, which shows that there is a relationship between the green regions here, and the motor areas of cerebral cortex, down into the pons. This is rostral, down to the caudal pons, and the green is represented more in the caudal pons of the monkey, whereas there are projections from the prefrontal cortices, the posterior parietal cortices in blue, the superior temporal regions in red, and the parastriate and parahippocampal regions in orange, all terminating in the pons. And they do so with a mosaic of topographically arranged projections. So what we now know is that there are areas that are involved in planning, organizing, thinking, strategy formation, working memory, spatial organization and spatial awareness, language processing, visual place memory, limbic circuitry here in the cingulate giant, which we haven't shown here, all getting information into the pons, and from there it goes directly into cerebellum through the middle cerebellar peduncle. So this was the first demonstration of high-order areas from the cerebral cortex getting information to the cerebellum in order to be processed. Now the system has a feedback as well, and the work of Strick and his colleagues using the transsynaptic traces superimposed upon previous work of single tracer studies showing that if you make injections of a tracer in the motor cortex of the monkey, there are neurons labeled in the dorsal part of the cerebellar dentate nucleus and the interpositus nucleus. But if you make an injection of the tracer going back down to cerebellum from the prefrontal cortex, the neurons labeled in the cerebellar nuclei are in the dentate, in the more ventral and lateral region. So there is a feedback system as well as a feed-forward system, but not only to motor regions, but to non-motor areas as well. And if you then match up the cerebral cortical areas with areas in the cerebellum itself, the motor cortex M1 is talking to the anterior lobe, lobules 3, 4, 5, and partially lobule 6, with a second representation of lobule 8, and the prefrontal cortex is talking to crus 2, the lateral cerebellum, the newly evolved part of the cerebellar cortex. From there, the monkey studies of connectivity, we're going to jump forward to imaging in people. This is a series of studies done with my postgraduate fellows, Dr. Strudley and Valera, looking at where in the cerebellum there is activation as you lie in the scanner doing particular tasks. The first was a meta-analysis of a number of studies previously published that shows in the coronal views of the cerebellum of people, this is many studies together, mapped onto the cerebellar atlas, that there's a motor activation when you wiggle your fingers in the anterior lobe and lobule 8, which we now expect, but language processing activates lobule 6 and crus 1, spatial processing activates the cerebellum on the left side and also in the midline, and working memory activates cerebellum in the posterior lobe bilaterally. So we have a suggestion from the imaging that overlays what we saw in the monkey connectivity of a dichotomy of function. Motor phenomenology in lobule 3 through 5 in the anterior lobe, and encroaching lobule 6, and also lobule 8, and language, spatial, and working memory in the posterior lobe, each with its own topographic organization. In a single person line in the scanner, you get the same results. And similarly, in a group of results of 9 subjects in the scanner, grouped together, you see the motor phenomena, anterior lobe and lobule 8, primary and secondary motor, language processing in the cerebellar hemisphere on the right here. This is on the right cerebellum nodule 6 and cross 1. Spatial processing and working memory bilaterally in the posterior cerebellar hemispheres. Further, we find that the motor system in the cerebral cortex talks to nodule 5 and nodules 8 in particular, and the association areas prefrontal and posterior parietal talking to lobule 6 and 7 in the cerebellum. A nice dichotomy of motor versus cognitive processing. Still with imaging, we now have the ability to use resting state functional connectivity. And by this, we use the fluctuation of blood flow, the blood oxygen level dependent signal, and we look at how the signal in different parts of the brain oscillates. And those regions that oscillate in synchrony are thought to be functionally coupled. And we know from the work of Buckner and Wang and others, and a range of investigators across the world now, that there is a sensory motor system, there is an orange, the frontoparietal network, and the red is a default mode network, dorsal attention in green, ventral attention in purple, and the salience network, seen here more in the orbital and medial prefrontal areas. So that's the networks up in the cerebral hemisphere. What's extraordinarily interesting and important now as we go forwards is that these networks map onto the cerebellum. And they do so in a way that is now predictable, where we have again in the anterior lobe in lobule 8 a reflection of the sensory motor networks, whereas the more high order areas involved in visual attention, in default mode network, and thinking, planning, organizing, creativity, strategies, those are all coming down to the posterior cerebellar hemispheres and differentiating that from the sensory motor networks. My student Xavier Guel, working with John Gabrielli in the MIT lab, has taken the Buckner work further and shown the following, that whereas we have from resting state connectivity a suggestion of a primary and secondary motor representation, as we know from the work of Snyder many years ago, there is in addition a primary, secondary, and tertiary representation of cognitive processing. And using the large data set, many hundreds of people, in the Human Connectome project, we've been able to identify that in fact this primary and secondary representation of the motor system is there in the Connectome project, but also here for high-level processing, a primary, secondary, and tertiary level representation of cognitive processing, not only in the resting state networks, but also in task-based activity. What the implications are of the primary, secondary, and tertiary representations happens to be, that remains to be shown. But the fact that these exist gives us stronger information that in fact is a representation throughout the cerebellum in the human of cognitive and emotionally relevant areas that need to be further understood, both at the level of functional organization and clinical phenomenology. We now know about the networks in the cerebral hemispheres and the networks in the cerebellum, but you can take this a step further to look at the interaction between these two regions, cerebral cortex and cerebellum. Working with my colleagues at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center here in Boston, Mark Helko and Faranak Farzan with Alvaro Pasqualeone, have shown that if you stimulate the cerebellar vermis, you change the dorsal attention network upstairs. So you can modulate through transcranial magnetic stimulation the cerebellar focal areas and change networks up in the cerebral hemispheres. But if you move to the lateral cerebellum, the network you change is a default mode network, the network that's active when you're not doing anything in particular, when your brain is idling or thinking or creating or being in a space of mindfulness. So you can change your network upstairs depending on where you stimulate in the cerebellum, very much in line with the idea of functional topography in the cerebellum. Furthermore, and we'll come back to this in the theory discussion at the end, is that when you stimulate the vermis versus the lateral hemispheres, you change the different networks in the same direction. So the EEG, looking at the temporal dynamics of the processing, changes in the same direction. In other words, you affect different networks in the same direction by stimulating different places in the cerebellum. Well, that's all good and well. What happens if you go to the bedside and you actually spend time with patients to look to see what are the manifestations of all of this cerebellar neurobiology in patients with cerebellar dysfunction? I'm going to start, somewhat out of chronological sequence, with work that looked at the old question of structure-function correlation in brain organization. If you have a stroke in a particular part of the brain, one can get an understanding of what it is that that part of the brain does by studying the deficits that result. So, this is a stroke on a scan called diffusion-weighted imaging. The bright spot is the stroke in an area that's called the superior cerebellar artery distribution. And that irrigates the anterior lobe, what we now think of as the motor cerebellum. And this produces on an ataxia rating scale evidence of problems with control of the arm, of the leg, of gait perhaps, of speech and eye movements. That's the cerebellar motor syndrome. But if you have a stroke of similar size, in the territory irrigated by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is now the cognitive cerebellum, not the motor region, there is in fact on the ataxia rating scales no evidence of ataxia, but something else. And we've shown the same thing more recently with voxel-based lesion symptom mapping. And here, when the patients with a stroke involve the anterior lobe here in the coronal image, or in the sagittal image up the top of the cerebellum, the motor regions, or the cerebellar interpositus nucleus in particular, these people have the cerebellar motor syndrome. Ataxia, dysarthria, dysmetria, oculomotor abnormalities. On the other hand, when the stroke spares the anterior lobe, and the stroke involves the posterior lobe down here, the lateral hemispheres in particular, seen here in the sagittal image, or on the axial image, these folks do not have the motor syndrome, they have the syndrome I'm going to spend some time talking about now, which is a cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So many years ago, when I began realizing that the theory that we had proposed in the 1980s about cerebellar contribution to cognition, when that theory needed to be matched by a neurobehavioral correlate in patients, we did what clinicians do. We go to the bedside and we ask our patients, by examining them, what is it that we think that part of the brain is actually doing? And this is a young woman who had a cerebellar tumor resected. The tumor was discovered when she slipped on ice, and she fell, hit her head, had a scan that showed the tumor taken out, and she's able to stand and walk normally and talk okay. There was no problem with control of her arms or legs. But she had a personality change, and she was referred to us by the nurses, who alerted the neurosurgeons, that there was a change in this young woman. She was being childish, disrobing in the corridors, hiding under the bed covers, giggling and talking inappropriately. And with very old-fashioned, simple tests of cognition at the bedside, we identified the fact that she was unable to bisect a line and did so multiple times. This is called perseveration, which is seen in patients with frontal lobe disorder. She was unable to draw a clock, even when the outline was drawn for her. That's a visual spatial disorganization. And when asked to write a sentence, she wrote this a grammatism, I am a young girl who is 23rd, with also perseveration in her words. This in one slide is essentially the features that came to describe the syndrome, the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. As we looked at patients over the years and we came up with a clinical score to identify the severity of the deficits, we showed that executive function, reasoning, calculation, and affective changes were most prominent, and the affective changes were occurring when patients had midline lesions. There was some difficulty with visual spatial function, verbal memory, and language processing, but for the remainder they were not too badly impaired. And my colleague Janet Sherman took these folks into the neuropsychology laboratory and identified on these graphs, so 0 is normal, this is 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations below or above the mean, that there were problems with executive function, spatial cognition, verbal and visual memory, and as a group, patients' intellectual function was pushed off to the left or impaired. As you'll see, there are some folks who are fine within 1 standard deviation above or below the mean, and these are people whose lesions were either smaller involved the cerebellar anterior lobe. Those whose problems were primarily cognitive, a phonemic fluency task, how many words can you name that begin with the letter F or A or S, or the Ray complex diagram, and copying and remembering of a visual figure, or verbal and visual memory. These are the folks whose lesions were larger or involved the cerebellar posterior lobe. So right from the get-go, the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome of executive function, spatial impairment, language deficits, and personality change all were related to damage to the cerebellar posterior lobe. And the executive function problems included planning, set shifting, verbal fluency, abstract reasoning, and working memory deficits. The spatial cognition, as you've seen, is visual spatial organization and recall. Agrammatism, difficulty with the syntax of language. Aprosodia, lack of a change in the modulation of speech, and difficulty finding words in conversation. And a remarkable personality change from lesions of the midline with a blunting of affect on the one hand, or disinhibition and inappropriate behavior on the other. This syndrome now was described as the third cornerstone of clinical ataxiology by my colleagues Mario Manto and Peter Marion, along with the other two, the cerebellar motor syndrome and the cerebellar vestibular syndrome. This is an important clinical feature to the extent that the National Ataxia Foundation has a fact sheet on cognition and emotion in cerebellar disorders to give patients an awareness and understanding that the problems that arise with these high order functions is not a factor of them being depressed or as being in their head, but it's actually a problem of being in their brain. Something's happened to the neural substrates that are relevant for cognition and emotion. This work has been replicated now over the past 2 decades throughout institutions across the world in a number of different circumstances, and I'll show you just a couple. This is one that came out of work from the group here looking at multiple sclerosis. It has long been known that multiple sclerosis affects the cerebellum, but it's thought to have been important for motor control. What the group here showed is that the mapping of the white matter lesions in the cerebellum, as you see here in all cases in a coronal image of the middle cerebellar peduncle, those patients in whom there is preservation of cognitive performance have much less involvement to the middle cerebellar peduncle than those who are cognitively impaired. And the reason this is important is the middle cerebellar peduncle, as I showed you earlier, is the conduit by where the information from the cerebral hemisphere is conveyed into the cerebellum. We've also shown a few tweaks on the original observation, that the language impairments actually are not only agrammatism and anomia, and sometimes the stuttering as well as the dysarthria that you see in cerebellar patients, but there's a problem with the use of language to convey thoughts and to interpret the meanings of others. So metalinguistics, the use of ambiguity when things aren't entirely clear in sentences, or inferences that you mean something else other than what you've actually said, or the metaphor, using examples to explain something else, or the ability to express oneself in a grammatically correct manner and appropriate to context. These metalinguistic functions are not preserved in patients with cerebellar injury over and above any difficulty they may have with the clarity of their articulation. And similarly, as my postdocs Francisco Hoek and Xavier Guel have shown with us, that there is a problem of theory of mind, the ability to interpret and understand the kind of thoughts that somebody else may have. And that's so important for regulating behavior within a social context. This is the reading the mind and the eyes task that has been shown to be important in patients with autism spectrum disorders, and it turns out to be irrelevant in people who have acquired cerebellar injuries as well. And this has relevance for patients in their home life and in social interactions. A couple of years after the first paper came out that when we described the cognitive affective syndrome, we published the work that had been ongoing for a while of children who had cerebellar tumors resected. Tumors in the cerebellum are the commonest location for brain tumors in children. And here's an example of the medulloblastoma that has been resected in the child after surgery. And we show the same thing in the kids. In the attempt to copy, recall, and then later on recall the complex figure, we see a marked fragmentation of the response of this youngster with a cerebellar tumor. The point being that the children who had tumors taken out in the absence of radiation and the absence of drugs that can affect the brain structure like methotrexate, there were the same issues: problem solving, difficulty organizing verbal or visual spatial material, impairment of planning and organizing, language difficulties, long latencies, poor initiation, short responses, unable to elaborate on the context of a sentence, trouble with finding words or naming things, memory impaired for stories, better with some prompting, and a dramatic change in the regulation of their affect when the cerebellum midline was involved, or vermis lesions. So irritability, impulsivity, disinhibition, and labile affect were all part of the syndrome, and this is somewhat similar to the difficulty described across the world in children with cerebellar tumors resected, where there is a cerebellar mutism syndrome. Children stop talking for a few days, sometimes for months, after the midline surgery, and the cerebellar mutism may be associated with the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, the cerebellar motor syndrome, brainstem destruction, and other issues of cranial neuropathy from brainstem lesions. So the cerebellar mutism syndrome may occur in the setting of the cognitive affective syndrome, but they don't always go together. And you can have the cognitive affective syndrome even without the cerebellar mutism. But this is a major issue for pediatric neurosurgery, which is now being addressed directly by the surgeons to try and find ways to minimize damage to cerebellum when they go in and get the tumors out to save these children's lives and allow them to live going forward. I'll describe for you a rare experiment of nature. This is cerebellar agenesis. It's more likely a disruption of the cerebellum early on in utero or early life, as opposed to some gene disorder. These cases are rare. There are only a few of them in the world. We have about 10 patients here in our own group, and we'll be hearing about those in the future. There is no cerebellum back here in the posterior fossa, and the brainstem is flattened because the pons is normally quite nice and round, and that's where the neurons sending information to cerebellum are located. So that whole system is not present in people who have agenesis. This is an example of a man who's been following now for many years, with the z-score distribution on his side. One can see that there is an impairment in overall intellectual function, a marked impairment in visual spatial function, in phonemic fluency, and in the executive function tasks using trails A and B. And the problem described in the people that we saw was Sixpack Denim in 2002. There was difficulty with executive impairments, spatial cognition, language processing, and psychiatric or affective changes with autistic-like performances in some of these folks, obsessive rituals, difficulty with social cues, all of which speaks to a social cognition. If you'd like to log on to National Public Radio and you type in agenesis, you will find the very nice report describing this young man in their report by John Hamilton that had myself and Janet Sherman describing his case, and the gentleman describing his own story along with his family in his own words, and it presents some color and some vibrancy to the nature of the phenomena experienced by people who live life without a cerebellum. Still in the pediatric realm, it's important to note that when children have hemorrhages in the cerebellum early on, there are some neurological difficulties, changes in tone or motor delay, communication deficits, visual problems, expressive language, but there are also a variety of behavioral and social outcomes, with autism scores in fully 40% or more of these youngsters. So cerebellar damage as an isolated phenomenon early on leads to a range not only of motor problems, but of cognitive, social, emotional problems as well. And this leads into the next way to think about cerebellum and its role beyond the motor system. If you look at disorders that are defined by the neuropsychiatry, not the cerebellum motor system, but the neuropsychiatry, such things as attention deficit disorder, dyslexia, infants born very preterm, autism and schizophrenia, there is a long and now growing neuroscience that links cerebellum to these disorders. For example, autism, going back to the 1980s, was shown to have loss of the normal plump neurons deep down in the cerebellum as seen here in autism. So Bowman and Kemper hypothesized at that time that the cerebellum was important in the generation of the symptoms and the phenomena that characterize early infantile autism. And with more recent work now coming out of Children's Hospital in Boston, using the tuberous sclerosis complex as a mouse model of autism, we see abnormal social interaction and repetitive behaviors in that mouse model. I'll come back to that in a second. Schizophrenia has new information pointing to its relationship to cerebellum, not just enlargement of the fourth ventricle, or prominence of the cerebellar fissures, or lack of normal asymmetry, but we now see impairments in cerebellar frontal interactions, and we see in people who are at risk of cerebellum, or at risk of schizophrenia, that the cerebellum is actually smaller on voxel-based morphometry studies. And we now have some work coming out of my previous postdoc and a fellow who trained here in Boston, demonstrating that there is a relationship between cerebellum and autism in the human and in the mouse model. This is ongoing work representative of the evolving field of science of cerebellar neuropsychiatry. Cross 1 over here in the lateral part of the cerebellum is irrelevant in autism. There are abnormalities identified in autism spectrum disorder folks in that area, and there is impairment of the functionally connected circuits in autism spectrum disorder. In healthy controls, modulation of the cerebellum in the right cross 1 affects the connectivity with the inferior parietal lobule over here. And there is atypical functional connectivity in that disorder as well. In the mouse model, there is impaired connectivity between right cross 1 and the parietal lobe, and you can change the activity and the behavior of the mouse by stimulation or inhibition of right cross 1. So we have now an evolving field of the neurobiology and the neuropsychiatry of cerebellum and its relationship to these primary neuropsychiatric disorders, autism and schizophrenia prime amongst them. Similarly, when you look at patients who have classical neurodegenerative ataxias and you study the cerebellum, there are some remarkably interesting findings. We now know that if you do voxel-based lesion symptom mapping and look at the morphometry of the cerebellum in Alzheimer's disease and in frontotemporal dementia, there is regional atrophy in the cerebellum in crest 1 and crest 2 in Alzheimer's and in lobule 6 in frontotemporal dementia that are linked with the cerebral cortical areas that atrophy in those diseases. So we now bring the network idea of cerebrocerebellar interaction into play, not only when the disease starts in cerebellum, but when the disease, as we think, starts in the cerebral hemisphere. So the question now is the cerebellum in these disorders just a bystander, or does it actually have relevance? And when you do a review of Alzheimer's disease, there turns out to be a strong and robust history of cerebellar involvement in that disease that we have not paid attention to until now. I've talked about neuropsychiatry and this role in cerebellar role in that whole field of high order behavior. What I'll share with you now is that if you look at patients who have cerebellar injury, confined to cerebellum, and you look at the behaviors that are manifesting in that group of folks, there is a range of behaviors that fall within 5 domains of neuropsychiatric regulation: attentional control, emotional control, autism spectrum disorders, psychosis spectrum disorders, and social skill set. And all the symptoms that map onto those 5 domains seem to have an exaggerated or overshoot or hypometric feel to it, and a negative, diminished, or hypometric component to it. So like the motor system with overshoot and undershoot, we think that in the neuropsychiatric domain, there's also overshoot and undershoot within these 5 domains of behavior. We have taken those symptoms and developed a preliminary version of a scale to assess neuropsychiatry in folks who have cerebellar disorders along the domains of attention, emotion, autism spectrum, psychosis spectrum, and social skill set, and applied this in a preliminary way, which I'll share with you today. This is a young man who we heard about with what sounded like first break schizophrenia. Between the ages of 14 and 17, he had progressive decline in school ability, progressive school failure, and rumination, change in his ability to interact with others, a loss of empathy, progressive internalization of his thoughts. And the family was worried about him, and the psychiatrist who was taking care of him became concerned that he had headaches along with his constipation, and so he had a scan. And the scan demonstrated a Chiari malformation with the cerebellar lobule 9 pulled right down below where it should be, and a cyst in the spinal cord called a serix. And after a long series of conversations with his parents and his caregivers, we decided to take him to surgery, mostly because this meets all the criteria for surgically treatable Chiari malformation. But before we did this psychiatric rating scale, and in a graph form, where 0 to maybe 4 or 5 would be normal, he was scoring very high on that scale for the total score and the positive and negative symptom scale of the Cerebellar Neuropsychiatric Rating Scale. And within a month after surgery, the graph looked like that. So I present this case as a work in progress, but there's something about both the phenomenology in Chiari, the neuropsychiatric features, and the scale to pick it up that needs to be explored as we go forwards. And that's one of the reasons I'm talking about this today, so we can try and promote further work in the field across the discipline. One of the missing pieces in the analysis of cognition in patients with cerebellar injury is the ability to determine, without spending the whole day in the lab, what the behavior is. Can we identify the cognitive impairments, and how do we do so? So working with my team, we performed full neuropsychological batteries in a large number of patients and controls. We derived those tests that seemed to be most predictive of pathology in those patients. We identified a little test battery from that group, and then we validated that scale in another series of patients and healthy controls. This is now the Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Schmahmann Syndrome Scale. This is published in Brain just a couple months ago, and it's available for your use. It looks at categories that are most predictive of figuring out whether a person who has these problems is a patient or a cerebellar or a healthy control. Cerebellar patient or healthy control. So the test is selective, but not yet specific, because we haven't looked at this in other diseases. It looks at semantic, phonemic, and category switching fluency, a verbal recall, digit span forwards and backwards, cube drawing and copying, similarities, a go-no-go task of disinhibition, and a sense of the affective range of the patient's performance. So this should allow us to examine patients in the clinical setting in a 10-minute screen to determine whether or not a patient with a cerebellar problem in fact has a cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, and I invite you to use that. So let's wrap this up with some concepts.
Yeah.
Back in the late 1980s, when I was putting this all together as a way to go forwards, we proposed the Dysmetria of thought theory. And the theory of Dysmetria of thought is that in the same way the cerebellum regulates motor control, so does it do that to higher order function. The rate, rhythm, force, and accuracy of movements are matched in the higher order domain by speed, consistency, capacity, and appropriateness of mental or cognitive processes. So, in other words, what the cerebellum is doing to motor control is doing to everything else. And the idea of unpredictability and the logic to social and societal interaction maps on well and matches the kind of difficulties I've been describing in the patients that we've been seeing over the last almost 4 decades. We then need to move from theory to therapy. And given that the cerebellum, we think, is modulating behaviors, trying to improve neuropsychiatric phenomena, we worked with a patient population of schizophrenia, very difficult to control, difficult to treat. This is refractory patients. A small group, it was a proof of principle study, in which we stimulated the back of the cerebellum, the vermis, which we think is the central feature of the limbic cerebellum. I'll come back to that in a second, to see if we could produce improvements in the well-being of patients with schizophrenia. And what we saw is that in the positive and negative symptom scale of schizophrenia, there's an improvement in the negative symptoms, which is difficult to do at the best of times. Depression improved, and the sense of happiness, sadness, and alertness all improved by the patient's subjective report. as did a continuous performance task, which is a test of attention. So that's an attempt to bring the therapy from the initial theory. And this work has now been taken up by others around the world. And there's a new approach to treatment using neuromodulation, but targeting cerebellum because of its wide connectivity to multiple regions of the cognitive and limbic cerebral hemispheres in order to try and improve outcomes in patients with these very debilitating disorders. So let me go back to this young woman I presented at the outset. After years of inability to speak and get up and behave like a normal youngster would, she came to us with the parents asking us for help. And another 2 months in rehab didn't make a difference. And so we tried brain stimulation with transcranial magnetic stimulation. And after a week of the stimulation applied to the cerebellar vermis, there was a remarkable improvement in her constellation. She's able to get up and start speaking and start walking and take food by mouth and put clothes on, eventually go back to school and get on the dean's list at school, still with some motor impairments, but a marked improvement. And I think what this does is it opens the question for us as a field. What is it that transcranial magnetic stimulation does to jumpstart the process of recovery? Is there a role for neuromodulation coming in via cerebellum to improve upstairs neural circuits? And do we have a new way to treat people who we couldn't treat before, using cerebellum and the theories and the new information and knowledge about cerebellum based on this work and the work around the world that has evolved in this new exciting field of the cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. So let me come back to the theory about how this is all put together. Because if you have an understanding of how this works, then the understanding can deepen using patients and using patient response. We can also have somewhere to put our observations. It's no longer a puzzle, although the questions continue. We have a framework within which to think about the cerebellar contribution to higher function. And it starts off like this. Remember the slide at the beginning about the distributed neural networks in the cerebral hemispheres? Well, the cerebellum is an integral node in those networks. In the distributed neural circuits, upstairs and downstairs, that subserve sensory motor function, cognitive processing, autonomic function I haven't talked about now, and the affective regulation. And remember that the cerebellar cortex is essentially homogeneous throughout, but the connections are different. And therefore what the cerebellum is doing to these different systems, sensory motor, cognitive, and limbic, but it's doing the same thing. There's a topography of behavior. There's a sensory motor cerebellum at lobule 4 and 5 on the top here, and lobule 8 down the bottom. And the vestibular cerebellum in lobule 10 and part of lobule 9. But the cognitive affective cerebellum is the huge expanse of the human cerebellum. Lobule 6, crus 1, crus 2. That's all cognitive and affective. And there's a medial to lateral topography where the midline is the limbic cerebellum, the fastigial nucleus, and the vermis. This is autonomic regulation, affect, emotionally important memory. And the hemispheres are the executive, visual, spatial, linguistic, learning parts of cerebellum. There's a cognitive limbic dichotomy where limbic is midline, cognitive is lateral. The homogeneity of cerebellar cortex is important not just at the level of anatomy, but at the level of theory and understanding how this works. The idea is that the architecture of cerebellum is consistent throughout, allowing it to do one thing. That's the universal cerebellar transform. It's how information is modified in cerebellum. It's the computation of the cerebellar cortex. Our idea is that the cerebellum optimizes performance by modulating behavior around a homeostatic baseline. It doesn't make things, it makes things better. It does it automatically, implicitly, without conscious awareness, but according to context. So that's what the cerebellum is doing. It's keeping things where they should be appropriate according to context. The anatomic specificity of the circuits I described allows cerebellum to contribute to multiple domains of processing throughout the spectrum of a human behavior. The corollary, though, is that the cerebellum breaks down, it should break down the same way as well. If it does one thing, it should break down the same way. And that's the idea of dysmetria. So lesions of the sensory motor cerebellum produce the dysmetria of movement, or the cerebellar motor syndrome, and lesions of the cognitive or limbic cerebellum produce dysmetria of thought and emotion, or the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. There are many implications of this work. What's so exciting and gratifying for me through the years now, almost 40 years into this, is that there's a whole field of cognitive neuroscience looking specifically at these questions. The brightest of the young investigators coming up and the extraordinary new technology allows us to take this to a new level of investigation, which will feed back on patients and patient care. Because there's a range of direct implications for people who deal with cerebellar diseases in particular, but neuropsychiatry in general. There was a need to know imperative. The cognitive affective syndrome is not in their head, it's in their brain. There is a brain problem resulting in these behavioral issues. Once we know that as the field of medicine caring for these folks, and neurologists need to know this, the recognition can lead to intervention, because now there are windows for cognitive rehab and perhaps cross-modal therapies. And as I showed you with that young woman and with the Chiari patient, that in primary neuropsychiatric diseases like autism or schizophrenia, and maybe even beyond, as I described in Alzheimer's and in frontotemporal, there is a role for the cerebellum in the pathophysiology of these disorders, and there are now new opportunities for treatment, novel strategies for intervention that were inconceivable until we had changed our thinking. We had this revolution in thinking about cerebellum not as a motor control device, but as cerebellum as critical for the modulation of all behaviors, cerebellum doing its thing, applying its transform to the multiple ranges of behaviors across the domains of the human spectrum of behavior. So I'll end with that and just make sure that we pay attention to the folks that we've worked with through the years. This kind of work is collaborative, it's interdisciplinary, we learn from our mentors, and we learn from our students, and we learn from our patients. I want to pay tribute to all the folks who worked with me and my lab through the years to reach this point in time. So I will be happy to answer questions that come through the email system as we go, and for those who are interested in this field, which is perhaps one of the most exciting fields in neuroscience today, I would welcome you into that and look forward to an ongoing dialogue with those of you out there who are interested in cerebellum and in cerebellar neurobiology and neuropsychiatry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Schmahmann, for that informative presentation. I would also like to thank LabRoots for making this educational webcast possible. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that this webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through June 2018. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.